crack of a branch snapping brought Mason Hayes to full alert. He lowered the fence stretcher, his weathered hands freezing in mid-motion. His eyes, sharp despite his 53 years, scanned the tree line bordering his Montana property. The wind carried the bite of coming winter, but something else rode beneath it, the unmistakable sense of being watched. Mason set down his tools with deliberate calm and reached for the Remington 700 leaning against the nearby fence post. The rifle slid into his grip like an old friend, his finger resting outside the trigger guard as he'd been trained. 20 yards east, fresh boot prints marked the mud near his property line. Too small to be his, too deliberate to belong to a hunter. "Third day this week," he muttered, chambering around with practiced efficiency. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention to the county road. A battered pickup slowed as it passed his land, the driver's face hidden beneath a ball cap. Mason memorized the plate before it disappeared around the bend. His jaw tightened. After 8 years of solitude in this remote stretch of Montana backcountry, trouble had finally found him. Or perhaps he'd found trouble. The memory of the woman at the rusty nail surfaced unbidden, hazel eyes haunted by fear, shoulders hunched against the world. He'd seen that look before, in the mirrors of field hospitals in Fallujah. Mason shouldered his rifle and gathered his tools. The fence repair could wait. Tonight would bring a hard freeze, and he had other preparations to make. The '78 Ford F-150 groaned beneath him as Mason navigated the rutted mountain road into Eagle Ridge. He'd rebuilt the 3x51 Windsor engine twice since buying the truck, replacing the carburetor and fuel pump himself. The familiar rumble of American steel and the smell of old leather grounded him when the memories threatened to surface. The town appeared through swirling snow, a ragged collection of storefronts clinging to existence against the brutal Montana winter. Mason parked in front of Henderson's general store, his boots crunching on fresh snow as he stepped down from the cab. Inside, he moved with military precision, gathering only what he needed: ammunition, coffee, medical supplies, kerosene. No wasted motion, no impulse purchases. Each item served a purpose in the Spartan existence he'd carved for himself after 3 tours with Force Recon. "Storm's coming in hard," Henderson remarked as Mason laid his supplies on the counter. "Radio says 18 inches by morning." Mason nodded once. "Got enough?" Henderson raised an eyebrow. "You expecting company out there?" "Just planning ahead." The shop owner studied him for a moment before bagging the supplies. "Funny thing, Sheriff was asking about you yesterday." Mason's expression remained neutral, but his mind clicked into high alert. "That's so. Said some folks were asking around town about who lives out on the old Whitman place." Henderson slid the bags across the counter. "Thought you might want to know." "Appreciate it." Mason placed 3 $20 bills on the counter, collecting his change without further comment. The rusty nail sat at the end of the block, its neon sign sputtering against the gathering darkness. Mason hesitated, then turned toward it. One drink before the storm hit. One chance to see if she was still there. The bar was crowded, locals seeking warmth against the coming blizzard. Mason took his usual spot at the far end, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Bill, the bartender, slid a whiskey toward him without being asked. She wasn't there. Mason felt an unexpected twist of disappointment, followed immediately by relief. Better for her to have moved on. His land wasn't a sanctuary. It was a fortress built for one. He was halfway through his drink when the door banged open, letting in a gust of snow and the woman from 3 days ago. Her thin jacket was dusted white, her face pale with cold. She scanned the room with the wariness of prey, then slipped into a corner booth. A moment later, 3 men entered. The leader, tall, confident, predatory, spotted her immediately. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached her table. Mason watched over the rim of his glass. Not his business, not his fight, until the tall one grabbed her arm, twisting hard enough to make her gasp. Mason was moving before his mind registered the decision. 20 years of training condensed into a singular focus as he crossed the room, boots silent despite his size. Problem here? His voice cut through the bar noise, flat as the barrel of a gun. The tall man turned, irritation flickering across his face. Private conversation. Move along, old man. Mason didn't move, his gaze steady. Didn't look private to me. Ryan, don't, the woman whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Please. Ryan released her arm, turning his full attention to Mason. You the local welcoming committee? Or just looking to get your ass handed to you? The two men who'd entered with Ryan shifted positions, flanking Mason. One slipped a hand inside his jacket. Careful, Mason said quietly, his eyes never leaving Ryan's face. Your friend there is about to make a serious mistake. Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, made Ryan hesitate. His eyes narrowed as he reassessed the man before him, noting the military straight posture, the scarred knuckles, the cold calculation in his gaze. Sarah and I have history, Ryan said, forcing a smile. Just a lover's quarrel. Looks finished to me, Mason replied. He glanced at Sarah. Ma'am. Her throat worked as she swallowed. I want to be left alone. The bar had gone silent, the tension electric. Ryan's face hardened, but something, preservation instinct, perhaps, kept him from crossing the line. Another time then, he said, his voice carrying a promise of retribution. He backed away, gesturing for his companions to follow. At the door, he paused. This isn't over, Sarah. Not by a long shot. When they were gone, Mason turned to leave, his intervention complete. Sarah's voice stopped him. They'll be waiting outside, she said, her voice barely audible. For me. Mason considered his options, weighing the complications against his instinct to avoid entanglement. The storm would hit within hours. The smart play was to head home, secure his perimeter, wait it out alone. Instead, he found himself saying, My truck's out front. I can give you a ride wherever you're headed. Hope and suspicion warred in her eyes. I don't have anywhere to go. Mason nodded once. Decision made. Then you'd better come with me. Storm's coming. The blizzard descended in earnest as the F-150 climbed the mountain road toward Mason's property. The wipers fought a losing battle against the snow, creating brief windows of visibility before the white curtain closed again. Mason drove with the focused precision of a man who knew every inch of the treacherous road. Sarah sat rigid beside him, clutching her small backpack to her chest. She hadn't spoken since they'd left town, her body tense with the wariness of someone expecting a trap. Military? She finally asked, breaking the silence. Mason glanced at her. That obvious? The way you handled those men, controlled, precise. She paused. Like my brother, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Mason nodded. Marines, Force Recon, 3 tours in Iraq. That where you got that? She nodded toward his left hand, where a jagged scar ran from wrist to knuckles. IED, outside Fallujah. Mason downshifted as the truck began to climb a steeper section. You were a nurse. Sarah's head snapped toward him, surprise evident. How did you? The way you looked at my hand, assessing, professional. Mason guided the truck through a patch of black ice with practiced ease. Plus, there's a faded ID badge in your jacket pocket. St. Mary's Hospital. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. 2 years of nursing school. Never finished. The smile faded. Life got complicated. Ryan? She nodded, turning back to the window. Ryan! They crested the final ridge, and Mason's cabin appeared through the swirling snow, a fortress of timber and stone, built to withstand the brutal Montana elements. Smoke curled from the chimney, carried away by the howling wind. Home sweet home, Mason said, pulling up to the covered area beside the cabin. Sarah stared at the structure, something like recognition in her gaze. "You built this yourself." It wasn't a question, but Mason nodded anyway. "After I got back, needed something to do with my hands." Inside, the cabin was Spartan but meticulously organized. A modified wood stove dominated the main room, radiating heat through a system of ducts Mason had engineered himself. The furniture was minimal: a solid table with two chairs, a sofa positioned for defense rather than comfort, shelves lined with books on engineering, survival, military history. A weapons cabinet stood locked against the far wall. Sarah took it all in with a single glance. Strategic positioning, clear sight lines to all entrances, reinforced door frames. She met his eyes. "You built a fortress." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with her assessment. "Coffee?" She nodded, setting her backpack down carefully. "What do you want in return?" The blunt question hung between them, heavy with implication. Mason understood immediately what she was offering, what she'd been forced to offer before. "Help with chores," he said firmly. "Storm's going to pin us down for at least 3 days." "Plenty to do." He filled the kettle and set it on the stove. "You take the bed. I'll sleep on the couch." Suspicion crept back into her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Mason considered the question, weighing truth against comfort. "Because someone should," he said finally. Then more quietly, "Because I've been where you are. On the run, nowhere to go, no one to trust." He turned back to the stove, uncomfortable with the admission. "One rule in this cabin: respect. You give it, you get it." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I can work. I'm not afraid of hard labor." "Good," Mason replied, "because we've got a long 3 days ahead of us." The blizzard's fury peaked that night, wind screaming around the cabin's corners, testing every joint and seam of Mason's craftsmanship. The temperature plummeted, transforming the world outside into a frozen wasteland. Mason stood at the window, watching ice crystals form along the edges of the glass. His breath fogged the pain as he scanned the perimeter, an old habit from his days on patrol. "You're expecting them," Sarah said from behind him. Mason didn't turn. "Ryan doesn't strike me as the type to let things go." "He's not." Sarah moved to stand beside him, wrapped in a blanket Mason had given her. "He'll wait out the storm, then come looking." "How long were you with him?" 2 years. Her voice dropped. "Long enough to know what he's capable of." Mason nodded, processing the information. "You got away once. That took courage." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Desperation, not courage. He killed someone, Mason. A man who tried to help me, just like you did." Her eyes, when they met his, were haunted. "I don't want your blood on my hands, too." Mason absorbed this revelation without visible reaction, though his mind was already adjusting plans, cataloging defenses, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow we prepare." Dawn broke clear and brutal, the storm having spent its fury overnight. The world outside the cabin was transformed. Drifts 6 feet high, trees bowed under the weight of snow, the landscape rendered alien in its pristine whiteness. Mason was already up, methodically cleaning his Remington 700 at the table. The rifle's parts were arranged in precise order on a clean cloth, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Sarah emerged from behind the curtained alcove, sleep-tousled but alert. She watched him work for a moment, then asked, "What's the plan?" "First, breakfast," Mason replied, reassembling the rifle with swift, precise movements. "Then we assess our situation." The practical work of survival structured their day, checking supplies, reinforcing vulnerable points in the cabin, establishing clear fields of fire from strategic positions. Mason moved with the disciplined focus of a man preparing for combat, while Sarah followed his lead with surprising aptitude. By mid-afternoon, they had transformed the cabin into a defensible position. Plywood reinforced the windows, supplies were staged for quick access, and multiple escape routes had been established. As Mason instructed Sarah on the operation of his backup radio, a flash of movement at the tree line caught his attention. He froze, hands signaling Sarah to silence. There, almost invisible against the white backdrop, a figure moving from tree to tree, scouting the property. "They're here," Mason said quietly, reaching for the Remington. "Earlier than I expected." Sarah's face paled. "How many?" "At least one scout. Probably more waiting." Mason moved to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the plywood. "Get to the back room. Remember the plan." She hesitated, then touched his arm briefly. "Mason, thank you. Whatever happens." He nodded once, acknowledging what remained unspoken between them, the connection that had formed in less than 24 hours of shared danger. As Sarah moved to the back room, Mason settled into position by the window, rifle steady in his hands. The scout had disappeared from view, but Mason knew he hadn't left. They were being assessed, their defenses evaluated before the main assault. The minutes stretched into an hour, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of settling snow. Mason remained motionless, his breathing slow and controlled, his mind clear. This waiting, the suspended moment before combat, was familiar territory. The sound of approaching engines finally broke the stillness. 3 vehicles moving up the access road. Mason counted through his scope. 7 men, all armed, spreading out in a standard flanking pattern. Ryan led them, confidence in his stride as he approached the cabin. "Mason Hayes," he called out, voice carrying across the snow-covered yard. "I know you're in there. Send Sarah out, and we can all walk away from this." Mason didn't respond, watching through his scope as the men positioned themselves around the property. 2 carried shotguns openly. Another held what looked like a gas can. "Last chance, Hayes," Ryan continued when no answer came. "She's not worth dying for." Mason glanced toward the back room where Sarah waited, saw the mixture of fear and determination in her eyes, and made his decision. He moved to the door, positioning himself to the side before calling out, "She's not coming out, Ryan. You're trespassing on private property. I'm giving you one chance to leave." Ryan's laugh carried through the cold air. "Or what? You'll call the sheriff? Nearest law is 40 miles away, old man." "Wasn't planning to call anyone," Mason replied calmly, sliding the bolt on his rifle loud enough to be heard outside. The sound of a shotgun being racked echoed in response. "We're coming in, Hayes. One way or another." Mason turned to Sarah, his voice low and steady. "When I move, get to the cellar tunnel. Don't wait for me." "What are you going to do?" Fear edged her whisper. "Create a decision point." His eyes had shifted to something Sarah hadn't seen before, the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. Force them to choose between their mission and their survival. Before she could protest, Mason killed the cabin lights. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by moonlight filtering through the plywood-covered windows. He moved to a pre-selected firing position with silent efficiency, the Remington balanced in his hands. Outside, one of Ryan's men approached with the gas can, intent on dousing the porch. Mason's shot cracked through the night, hitting the ground at the man's feet with surgical precision. The man stumbled backward, dropping the can. "That was a warning," Mason's voice carried across the yard. "Next one counts." Chaos erupted outside. 2 men fired shotguns blindly toward the cabin, pellets thudding harmlessly into the reinforced walls. Others scattered for cover behind vehicles. Mason moved to another position, firing again, this time taking out the headlights of their vehicles, plunging the yard into deeper darkness. Every shot was calculated, designed not to kill but to demonstrate capability and control the battlefield. The dance continued for precious minutes, Mason firing, moving, creating the impression of multiple defenders through disciplined tactics. Ryan's men grew increasingly desperate, their coordinated approach dissolving into individual survival responses. When Mason spotted two men attempting to circle behind the cabin, he slipped out the rear door, moving with a silence that belied his size. The first man never saw him coming. A precise strike to the brachial plexus dropped him without a sound. The second managed to turn before Mason's boot found the nerve cluster behind his knee, sending him to the ground with a muffled cry. Inside, Sarah had positioned herself at the back window with Mason's shotgun, covering his return. She watched in astonishment as he systematically neutralized the threat, using the minimum force necessary to disable without killing. A crash from the front of the cabin pulled her attention. Ryan and another man were attempting to break through the reinforced door, the wood groaning under repeated impacts. Sarah steeled herself, raising the shotgun the way Mason had shown her. The door gave way with a final crack. The man rushed in, only to be met by Mason, who had circled back through the side entrance. A precise strike collapsed his windpipe, sending him to the floor, gasping. Ryan appeared in the doorway next, pistol raised. His eyes widened at the sight of Mason emerging from the shadows, then narrowed with fury. He fired once, the shot going wide as Mason rolled behind the table. "It's over, Ryan," Sarah called, stepping into view with the shotgun aimed. "Leave us alone." Ryan's attention snapped to her, his face contorting with rage. "You ungrateful bitch," he snarled. "After everything The words died in his throat as Mason rose from behind the table, the M1911 45 in his hand leveled at Ryan's chest. "Drop it," he said, voice deadly calm. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Ryan's finger tense on the trigger, his eyes wild with thwarted rage. Mason steady as stone, his aim unwavering. "You don't know what she is," Ryan spat. "What she's done." "I know enough," Mason replied. "I know men like you, bullies who only feel strong when someone else feels weak. She belongs to me." Ryan's control was slipping, his hand trembling visibly. "I'm not property," Sarah said firmly, the shotgun unwavering in her grip. "I never was." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, seemed to finally penetrate. Ryan's face cycled through rage, desperation, and finally a cold calculation. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You think one old Marine can protect you forever?" "He doesn't have to," Sarah replied. "I can protect myself." The standoff stretched taut as a tripwire, each second an eternity of potential violence. Then unexpectedly, the wail of sirens cut through the night, distant but approaching fast. "Cavalry's coming," Mason said quietly. "Your move, Ryan." Defeat flickered across Ryan's face as the strategic reality sank in. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Yes," Mason said, stepping fully into view. "It is." The sheriff's department arrived in force, 4 patrol cars cutting through the snow with chains on their tires. Ryan and his men were taken into custody, their vehicles impounded. Mason and Sarah gave their statements, the deputy sheriff nodding grimly when they described Ryan's history of violence. "We've had our eye on him for months," the deputy explained. "Reports from 3 counties. Just never had enough to make charges stick." He glanced at the subdued men being loaded into patrol cars. "This should do it." Dawn found Mason and Sarah on the porch, watching as the last patrol car disappeared down the snowy road. Exhaustion lined both their faces, but beneath it lay something else, the quiet acknowledgement of a battle survived together. "How did they know to come?" Sarah asked, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Didn't leave that to chance," Mason admitted. "Rigged a timer to the emergency band radio. Old trick from my days in the sandbox." Sarah smiled faintly. "Clever." "Lucky," Mason corrected. "Could have gone very differently." They fell silent, watching the sun climb over the snow-covered mountains. The landscape sparkled, pristine and peaceful, as if the night's violence had never happened. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally. Mason considered the question. The logical answer would be to take her to town once the roads cleared. Let her find her way forward, back to the original plan. But something had shifted during those tense hours. Something he couldn't quite name but felt with absolute certainty. "That depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether you want to stay." Sarah turned to look at him directly, surprise evident in her expression. "You'd let me stay? After all this?" "Not let you," Mason clarified. "Ask you." Her eyes searched his, looking for the catch, the hidden agenda. Finding none, her expression softened. "Why?" Mason hesitated, searching for words that didn't come easily after years of solitude. "Because you fought beside me instead of running. Because you faced your fear instead of letting it own you." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "Because for the first time since Iraq, I remembered what it means to protect something that matters." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple brass ring, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "My father gave it to her when they had nothing but this land and a promise." He held it out, not on bended knee, not with flowery words, but with the same direct honesty that defined him. "It's yours if you want it, along with my name." Sarah stared at the ring, then at Mason, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know what matters," he answered. "I know you're stronger than you believe. I know that in 24 hours, you showed more courage than most show in a lifetime." Sarah took the ring with trembling fingers, sliding it onto her own. It fit loosely, but it fit enough. "I don't need a preacher to tell me what this means," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion rarely expressed. "Just your word." "You have it," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "And you have me, not because I need protection, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose it." Mason nodded once, the gesture containing all he couldn't say. He held out his hand, and Sarah took it, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they'd done it for years. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered land, they stood together on the porch of the cabin that had become a fortress and would now become a home. "We should get to work," Mason said finally. "Door won't fix itself." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we have a lot to build." 1 year later, the cabin had evolved. A new room extended from the back, built with the same careful precision as the original structure. Garden beds, dormant under winter snow, lined the southern exposure. A smokehouse stood near the lean-to, which now housed 4 horses instead of 2. Mason sat on the porch, working oil into a saddle leather, his movements methodical as always. But the vigilant tension that had once defined him had eased. He still watched the perimeter out of habit, but the weight of constant readiness had lifted from his shoulders. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew his attention. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle, always within reach, then relaxed as he recognized the town doctor's battered pickup. Sarah stepped out of the cabin, wiping her hands on a towel. The simple brass ring still circled her finger, now accompanied by a band Mason had forged himself from an old railroad spike. Not pretty, but solid, like them. "Right on time," she said, a smile warming her face. The doctor, a Vietnam veteran turned country physician, climbed from his truck with a medical bag. He nodded to Mason, then turned his attention to Sarah. "How's our patient today?" he asked. "Growing," Sarah replied, her hand moving to the swell of her abdomen. "Keeping me up nights already." "Taking after the father, then," the doctor chuckled. Mason set the saddle aside and stood, moving to Sarah's side with a protectiveness that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with love. As they walked inside, Mason paused at the threshold, looking back at the land that had once been his solitary refuge and now held so much more. The fence line he'd been repairing when he first sensed trouble, the new barn rising behind the lean-to, the future expanding before him in ways he'd never imagined when he'd first sought isolation in these mountains. A vow made not in a church with witnesses, but in a moment of truth with snow falling and danger at their door. A promise kept not through words, but through actions every day since. Mason Hayes had made many oaths in his life, to his country, to his fellow Marines, to the code he lived by. But none had changed him like the one he'd made to Sarah, an oath of protection that had become an oath of honor, binding them together against whatever storms might come. Because some vows, once spoken, become the foundation upon which everything else stands. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What moment in your life taught you about the value of keeping your word, even when it was difficult? Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. There's plenty more where this came from. Until next time, this is Frontier Tales signing off.